They stole everything from her, her family, her legacy, even her own birthday. But what they didn't know was that Alice had been watching, waiting, planning. And tonight, the game changes. The golden son, the beloved heir, he thought he had it all. But the truth, it was never his to begin with. So tell me, what would you do if you found out the empire they built was actually yours? Would you take it back? Would you make them pay? Because Alice, she's about to do both. And trust me, you don't want to miss this.
The manicured gardens and the soaring iron gates, which earlier felt more like prison bars than a barrier, were swallowed by darkness throughout the vast estate. Inside, glasses clinked in a symphony of riches and privilege. Golden light flowed from enormous chandeliers. Laughing rang out in waves. Every attendee felt privileged to be part of something so great. That evening was one of celebration. One night meant for him. Watching, Alice stood outside just beyond the reach of the lights, mute, invisible, missing. Her entire life she had been invisible, a shadow in the background of person's ideal narrative. Michael, the golden lad, the one with no wrongdoing capacity, the pride of the family, the heir. Alice had never been given more thought than a side issue. Should she be successful? It was natural. Should she fail? It evidenced she was never good enough. But this was the last insult, her night. Her 21st birthday ought to have come to her alone. Maybe a little gathering, acknowledging approaching adulthood. She had ventured once, dared to dream that things may be different. Rather, the home was crowded with visitors all here for Michael. Nobody even considered what this day ought to imply for her. From the stairway, she had watched for someone, anyone to notice, and her father had looked to her with just chilly disapproval when she had at last spoken out, and dared to wonder why her birthday had been deleted. Alice, you are not appreciative. Leave if you value nothing this family does for you. The words had dug farther than she could have imagined, not because they were surprising, but rather because of how naturally they had been spoken, like as though she were nothing, as if she never had been. She then went. She had no option, not because she wanted to. They had turned back to their drinks, their laughter, their lovely world, throwing her aside without thinking twice. They were unaware, though, that their planet was already collapsing underfoot. Alice knew the truth for several weeks. It had arrived in an envelope and slid between stacks of business records and neglected correspondence. A letter from her grandmother, her own grandmother, the one who had always noticed her, the one who had murmured comfort when none else would have. The will is what I mean. Alice had gone over it several times, her hands quivering with incredulity. Everything, the estate, the company, everything she owned. Not what Michael is referring to. Not in line with her father, hers, but they had kept it under cover. They had misled us, thinking they could take everything from her. They behaved as though she were nothing. That was their error. Over the past few weeks, she had been organizing, observing, waiting. Revenge was something delicate, something patient. It was not a flash of impulse, a slow, certain slide, and Alice was its architect now. And let me ask you something. If you were in Alice's shoes, would you have done the same? Would you have played the long game? Or would you have confronted them the moment you found out the truth? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Inside, Michael was in the middle of the room, admiring himself. Rising a glass, he flashed the smile that had delighted family, friends, business partners, and investors all around. Their parents grinned at him. Their pride choked the air. Alice entered, first invisible, then gliding across the sea of dead. As advised, the attorney was already in the study waiting. Driven to see justice done in a manner never possible in a courtroom, he had been more than ready to manage the legal process. The music turned off precisely midnight. Confused by the quiet, the guests murmured among one another. And then the attorney moved forward, with his steady voice cutting through the anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'm sorry for the interruption, but right now there has to be an urgent matter attended to." Eyes fixed on him, inquiry flitting across their faces. Still smiling, Michael hardly noticed the intrusion until the reading started. One had the letter read aloud. Truth tore at line by line out of the fiction they had constructed. Alice belonged to the estate. Alice owned this company. Everything Alice owned belonged to her. The laughs came to a standstill. The whispers gave way to gasps, then resentment. Their father sprang for the letter, his face contorted with wrath. Their mother held her pearls wide-eyed, lips quivering with denial. And Michael, for the first time in his life, was disoriented. "Alice," he murmured, the assurance in his voice breaking. "What has he done?" She slanted her head and started a gradual smile. I grabbed what was rightfully mine. The moment hung between them, a delicate thing just about breaking. And then it broke. The knock-on effects were instantaneous. Demanding explanations, their father yelled, threatening legal action. Their mother cried, begged, insisted that mistakes had to exist. And Michael turned to her, his face blank, a tempest roaring behind his eyes. But Alice was no more the subdued, compliant shadow they had cast aside. Right now she was the storm. The very people who had responded to her father, the security guards, now carried her orders. Ignoring their objections, they let the family one by one out, frantic attempts to hang on to a life that was no longer theirs. Alice observed from the gateway, as they were thrown into the frigid night. Their power, which they had carried for so long, had been taken from them and left vulnerable. Michael turned back, his breath obvious in the nighttime air. His jaw tightened, his palms squeezed into fists, his flawless calm shattered beyond recovery. "You will regret this," he said softly. Alice only laughed, a steady, subtle sound that made his back shiver. "No, Michael," she answered, her voice firm and unbroken. "I believe I will really enjoy it for the first time in my life." The doors closed with a last, thudding echo. Alice also stood by herself in the house that had once seemed like a cage, for the first time. But today it belonged to her. Hers to change, hers to manage, if she so wanted, hers to burn. Outside, the night dragged on, the world advancing apathetic to what had lately happened. Inside, Alice trailed her fingers along the walls that had once imprisoned her, now only a monument to a family that had vanished. She strolled through the halls. She tossed her head back and laughed as she stood in the middle of it all. Now the house was empty, once bursting with the constant noise of riches and luxury. The great estate now stood in terrible quiet. Alice was alone in it, first in her life, nor a ghost prowling the margins, nor an afterthought hanging in the background. This house, this enterprise was hers. She had also taken care to confirm it. Her fingertips followed the mahogany railing of the great staircase, each step echoing in the nothingness. Cold, scornful features of ancestors who had created this dynasty gazed back at her from the paintings lining the walls. Men who would never have believed that it would all belong to the daughter they had discounted. She considered what people would view of her now. Not that it made any difference. Alice had emerged triumphant. Still, success was an unusual thing. It felt neither the gratification of justice done, nor an explosive triumph. Rather, it settled into her bones like a silent, crawling creature. Her house was yours. She owned the company. Her family had been turned into nothing, sent out. Still, a nagging idea chewed at the margins of her consciousness as she stood in the middle of her new nation. This was not ended. Michael would not allow it to be. Alice sat at the big dining table drinking coffee from a china cup originally reserved just for her parents early the next morning. The sunlight poured through the huge windows, lighting the unspoiled brunch before her. She was not hungry. She had spent the evening poring over the company papers, financial data, property deeds, everything under her control right now. Her grandma had left more than she had ever dreamed. Now hers, the family company, was a long-standing real estate and investment empire. But that power also brought vulnerability. Michael had been the heir to their father always, from the moment he could walk, groomed for leadership, and instructed the inner workings of the business. Alice had never been let join in it. She was now guiding something she hardly knew about. Michael had benefit in that regard. If she knew him at all, he wouldn't simply vanish into thin air. He battled. She had not to wait very long. The first strike struck by midday. A lawsuit, under the grounds of undue influence, a legal challenge to the will. The case was clear-cut. Alice had stolen what was properly Michael's, twisted their grandmother in her last days, pushed her into rewriting her will. It was absurd. It was risky, though, as well. Michael was intelligent. He was aware of the force of perspective. He could undo all she had battled if he could persuade enough people, board members, investors, judges, that she was simply a bitter, spiteful daughter seeking retribution. Alice carefully went over the papers, then neatly folded them, and put them aside. This was his preferred way of playing then. Alice was moving by dusk already. She convened a conference with the top officials of the business, men and women who had only answered her father, and Michael suddenly had to sit across from her. Their allegiance were dubious, their expressions uninterpretable. She paid no attention to courtesy. I assume you have all seen the lawsuit, she replied, her voice calm. A few quick looks at one other. One of them, an older man with graying hair and a watchful look, cleared his voice. It's unfortunate, he remarked, speaking gently. Michael has spent years working for this company. Regarding, there is great ambiguity about unknownity. Alice slid in and leaned forward. Legally binding is the will. Right now I own the company. Anyone challenging that is free to walk away. In silence, power was a shifting concept. People slanted toward whoever owned it, and Alice carried it right now. She understood, though, that wouldn't hold if Michael turned the tide. Sharp-eyed Executive Evelyn, one of the women seated at the table, watched Alice for a brief period before commenting. The lawsuit won't hold, she remarked. There is no proof of compulsion, but that's hardly the true issue, is it? Alice turned to meet her eye. No, she said. Michael isn't aiming to win in court, which is a drawback. He is aiming for public opinion court of review victory. And the true threat was that as well. Michael wouldn't need to bring her before court if the investors lost faith, if the corporate board started to question her, if the media turned against her. The corporation would pass through her fingers nevertheless. She would not let such happen. Over the next 2 weeks, Alice engaged in what she had never been permitted to do before, learning. She investigated the business both within and outside, visited with financial consultants, made calculated decisions under the direction of her father that would have once been inconceivable. More significantly, though, she sought to destroy the illusion Michael had created about himself. It was not hard. While Michael was excellent in masking his shortcomings, Alice had always been observing. She knew where to start looking. To preserve the family name, shady business practices, careless spending, backroom agreements their father had quietly corrected. She now brought those secrets forward. She said little more than enough for the appropriate folks to begin whispering, and the murmurs started to grow. It was too late by the time Michael knew what was occurring. As more and more of his own transgressions surfaced, the lawsuit collapsed. Investors started to leave, board members separated themselves. Once untouchable, his name was contaminated today. Alice, though, knew Michael too well to think he would quit. She was not shocked when she went back to the estate late one evening and discovered him waiting for her, his hands in his pockets. He stood in the great foyer with an expression incomprehensible. You have been busy, he remarked. Alice gave no flinch. Therefore have you. Though it didn't reach his eyes, a slow smile twisted at the corners of his mouth. You consider you to have one. She moved closer. The years of unspoken bitterness in the air electrified. Michael, I have one. And you know that as well. His mouth closed. She saw for the first time something almost like actual rage in his stare. You have no idea what you have started. Alice bent her head and said softly, Michael, no. You have no notion of my capacity. He fixed her for a long moment. Then he turned and went out the door without further word. Watching him go, Alice felt the weight of the occasion drop over her. This wasn't done away. Michael still needed work. Not even she was. She had picked everything from his handprint. But right now the game they were engaged in, that was only starting.
Revenge is one thing, but when the victim becomes the hunter, that's when things get truly dark. He thought he had it all, until he sat down at that table, until he saw that smile, until he realized she knew everything. Now there's no escape, no second chances, and by the end of the night, he'll be lucky if all he loses is his reputation. Click here to witness a revenge so ruthless, it will leave you questioning everything.